Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caden Lee, and I'm joined by my colleagues Luke Fontaine Richardson and Brennan Carlson. We are members of Realize Radicalization, a student-led countering violent extremism organization that aims to educate the public on radicalization and extremism. On today's episode of Get Real, our series where we interview a variety of experts in the field of radicalization and extremism, we are joined by Jesse Morton. Born in Pennsylvania, Jesse ended up moving to Brooklyn and eventually became a radicalized towards extreme and violent forms of Islam, after which he became known as Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. In 2007, he co-founded Revolution Muslim, a New York-based Salafi jihadist organization that largely used the internet to promote Al-Qaeda's ideology within the United States and recruit others to the cause. In 2009, Jesse helped launch Jihadi Recollections, arguably one of the first, if not first English language jihadi magazines, which later served as an inspiration for ISIS's own publications. However, in 2011, Jesse was arrested for taking part in threats against the creators of the show South Park. After his arrest, he became an informant and eventually turned his life around after his release from prison and disengaged from extremism. Today, he is the co-founder and head of Parallel Networks, an organization combating hate and extremism, and serves as a research coordinator for the Institute for Strategic Dialogues Against Violent Extremism Network in North America, as well as a development coordinator for the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Jesse holds a bachelor's degree in human services and a master's in international relations from Columbia University. He has lectured at Imam Mohammed Ibn Saud University and Sunderland University in Morocco, and has also done work at George Washington University's program on extremism. Along with this, Jesse is a certified substance abuse and mental health counselor in New York State and was named one of Foreign Policy's 2017 Global Thinkers. We at Realize Radicalization want to thank Jesse for taking time out of his busy schedule to talk with us today. And we can't wait to get started on this fascinating discussion. So Jesse, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Honored to be here.
So we'll kind of get right into it, kind of talking about your radicalization process. So can you describe to us how your journey of radicalization began and what was so appealing to you, I guess, about a more radical version of Islam? And did you sort of experience any of the typical push and pull factors that kind of brought you towards extremism?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out before we start that everybody's radicalization trajectory into violent extremism is an individualized process, highly complex, as is mine. I think I have a unique circumstance, but I do also think that a lot of the push-pull factors and risk factors for radicalization, along with the missing elements of protective factors, which we don't tend to talk about much, are prevalent and omnipresent in my tale. So I would say that the beginning trajectory of radicalization for me starts in childhood. I think I was predisposed to be susceptible to radicalization due to early adverse childhood experiences. And I think the more that we research radicalization and trajectories, it's a missing ingredient that we're not necessarily analyzing. There is some competent research out there, and my organization specializes as a result probably of my own interests and my own belief that the correlation between trauma and susceptibility or radicalization is in fact one worthy of being explored, as are trauma-informed approaches to dealing with other adverse phenomena, such as addiction, mental health treatment. I think that there's a lot we can learn from what we've learned about the realm of trauma-informed counseling and therapy and interventions if we're to apply them to this realm. So I was born in Pennsylvania, as you suggested in your intro, but I was the son of a prominent son of an attorney in New Jersey. My father was someone who during his senior year of high school experienced a cognitive opening or a traumatic experience in and of itself. Back then, we didn't know that smoking cigarettes correlated to lung cancer. And during his senior year of high school, his father passed away out of nowhere. By all accounts, I should have been an all-American boy. My descendants or my lineage goes back to the Mayflower. On my father's side of the family, sons and daughters of the American Revolution. My ancestor was a co-signer of the Declaration of Independence. I'm a direct descendant of Samuel Adams. So, that side of the family was very prestigious, sort of privileged. But during my father's senior year of high school, he kind of had, as a reaction to his father's own death, a adherence or a sort of affinity for counterculture movement of the 60s. He became what was called a beatnik, sort of the descendants of Jack Kerouac's On the Road sort of book. And then what that resulted in was him following a trajectory initially toward moving to small town Pennsylvania, where there's a university called Susquehanna University, which is typically home to affluent New Jersey kids that study pre-law and then go on to become lawyers. And that was his intention. While he was in school, he met a local working class woman, my mother, and impregnated her. And in those days, if you got a woman pregnant, you tended to, due to social pressures, get married. They didn't know each other all that well, but he decided that rather than pursue his education, he finished his bachelor's degree. And he moved us to a communal situation out in the middle of nowhere in small town Pennsylvania, where he could grow organic fruit and vegetables, marijuana in the woodshed, and live a very hippie-like lifestyle. So I grew up surrounded by 1960s counterculture, philosophical works from East India, Be Here Now, Jack Kerouac, Bob Dylan, Grateful Dead, all kinds of sort of counterculturalism. And I think that it's important to point that out because for me, we talk about extremist ideologies, but we don't talk about ideology as a component of culture. And my whole life and my whole world has revolved around not identifying with the in-group of the culture that I've belonged to. And I think in-group, out-group bias and in-group, out-group formulation can only occur when one does not feel like they belong to the society that they are essentially born in. And I think that tracks well with my own story. So unfortunately, my mother and father's relationship didn't fare very well. My father started to commit adultery on my mother at a very young age, was never home. He started a construction business, started to stay further and further away from the house. And that culture clash and their differences in upbringing and experience and class really started to come to the forefront. We were too poor for them to get divorced. And my mother, I think she was predisposed to do so because of certain mental health complications that have never been diagnosed, but she started to beat 2 of her 3 children. It's very typical for an abuser to not beat one of the children so that in their mind they can rationalize and justify why they're beating their other children. And me and my sister, I was the oldest of 3, suffered severe abuse in the middle of nowhere where no neighbors could hear the cries or the screams, spitting in our mouth, pulling our hair, poking our eyeballs, biting our legs, biting our bodies, punching us in the face, slapping us in the face. But psychological abuse was in so many ways worse than physical abuse. But because we were out in the middle of nowhere, somebody had to step forth and become the sibling that could help us cope with the matters. This is typical in dysfunctional families. The black sheep, the scapegoat is what they call it in the psychology of dysfunction. But I say all that to suggest that what it developed in me was a persona or a personality that was predisposed to define life and its meaning through suffering. I actually believe that I deserved to suffer, and was, in the sense that we identified trauma disassociated. My body and my mind were sort of separated. I had a lack of control over my impulses, became a self-fulfilling prophecy, somewhat of a what you might call a bad kid. But my mind was always trying to cope and trying to identify what the meaning was behind the abuse. I started to defend my sister. I saw myself as like a self-sacrificial sort of messianic figure willing to sacrifice for the greater good. And then when I started to go to the small rural school that was affiliated with the sort of farming community that we were embedded in, even though we weren't necessarily from there, as far as like my father's lineage was concerned, they took my IQ test and they determined that my IQ was high enough that they wanted me to go to be bused to the school where the affluent people in the community went to school at. And very early on, I recognized the class distinction that perpetuated throughout my life and set me forth on a trajectory towards anger and animosity towards a class that was living in a very different reality than most of the people and most of the situations I grew up around. And it was that anger and animosity that was exacerbated by the onset of globalization as I was a teenager. So this is the sort of macro environment that is ultimately crucial. Typically, because we come from the West, we look at individualized processes of radicalization because we live in an individualistic society. We don't look at the context in which the radicalization occurs. And in fact, if we're going to prevent radicalization, rather than concentrate on identifying the individuals that are radicalizing, I would argue that shaping the environment and the context so that it is inconducive or non-conducive to radicalization would be much more important. At 15 years old, after being beat and telling a guidance counselor at school that I was being beat and basically being blamed for lying and manipulating, even though it was untrue, I ran away. I felt like I was going to lose my mind. I took to the streets, went toward my father's destination, his origin, ran away to downtown Manhattan, New York City, lived in a drop-in center where you didn't have to show ID to prove that you were of age, out back of Port Authority. And then the hippies that my father had sort of raised me around came through town. A band called the Grateful Dead travels all over the country, does tours in the winter, does tours in the summer. And you kind of like, as Jack Kerouac put it, like the bus came by and I got on. It's like a caravan. And that was a counterculture for me so that I did not have to interact with American society and I could sort of withdraw. I also became politicized early on in my early teens. Very much an anarchist, communist, far leftist that was fascinated with the critical theory of people like Noam Chomsky, the utopic works of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World from George Orwell. And so again, this was all part of my sort of envisioning a utopia that would be more conducive to my safety. So I was never opposed to revolutionary ideas. And while everyone else was a hippie that was more worried about smoking weed and maintaining peace, I was sort of advocating for sort of revolution against what was going on in our society. So I think that early on, I had revolutionary tendencies, but I now realize that they were a projection of my animosity toward a society that I felt did not protect me. I had a lot of bitterness and defined that in a very class-based way, which was conducive to the far left and which later would feed my conversion and my own radicalization. So long story short, I traveled with them for a very long time. This band, saw every part of the United States, sold drugs on parking lots, learned how to provide for myself. The Grateful Dead is very much like a cult. And I think extremism entities can be as well. But at the end of the day, rather than selling drugs on parking lots and living a lifestyle that was different, I started to use the drugs that I was selling and then started to find myself in inner city ghettos copying narcotics, heroin, cocaine, etc. I was incarcerated for the very first time at the age of 18. It was only a very temporary stint in State College, Pennsylvania, in jail. But while there, the first day I was there, they asked if I wanted to go to the library. And I said, yeah, of course. And I went downstairs and the only good book I could find was the Autobiography of Malcolm X. And I read it cover to cover like 4 times before I was released. It was very much inspired by the tale of Malcolm because here was an individual that was traumatized. Here was an individual that had been shipped to private schools with people that he could not necessarily relate with. Here was an individual that engaged in criminal behavior, went to jail, then came out, changed his life and became a social justice warrior, something that fit with my self-sacrificial, messianic, revolutionary spirit. And so I started to dabble in religion. I was released and went back to traveling with the hippies for several more years, but was starting to read everything from the Jehovah's Witnesses to Buddhism to Islam to Christianity, really like dove into religion, was skeptical of it because I never thought I would belong to an organized religion, but increasingly found my life spiraling out of control. And a couple of years after that original incarceration, I was in Philadelphia, downtown Center City, where I was sort of facilitating drug transactions for people that get high in hotel rooms and send me to the ghetto to cop drugs for them, to bring them back, for me to profit or to get high or whatnot. And I was hustling with someone whose name was Shakur. And Shakur was influenced by a very predominant interpretation of Islam in Philadelphia that is Wahhabist or Salafist, Saudi Arabian inspired. A lot of people adopt this fundamentalism in jail, then they come home and they can't necessarily live up to the lifestyle that the austere lifestyle that it represents. And he ended up downtown sort of, hustling alongside of me. We were coming out of the projects, copying drugs, and the police shined this flashlight on us and said, lay down, you're under arrest. We didn't listen. We ran into an empty building. And he says to me behind the drywall that we hid behind, just say these words and everything will be okay. And he utters in Arabic what means there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. I have no clue what he's saying, but I do know that we got away. And as a result of us getting away, I was like, wow, that's divine intervention. And when I asked him more about it, and he told me that it was the testimony of faith to Islam, I was even more intrigued took me to his wife's house. I slept there for the night. And when I woke up in the morning, the Quran was laying open on a bookshelf. I read a verse, says, this is a book wherein there's no doubt, a guidance for the people of consciousness. And I was overcome with emotion. Long story short, he woke up, told him I wanted to convert to Islam. And he took me to the mosque, told me I could no longer stay with his wife. And I stowed away on a bus, Greyhound bus, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to Richmond, Virginia, where there was a concert by a lead guitarist for Fish, another hippie band. And I was arrested for selling false narcotics to an undercover police officer. I ended up in Richmond City Jail for several months while I waited for the drugs to come back from the lab. And I was recruited by a veteran of the Afghan Soviet Jihad, an individual who was a Moroccan that had migrated here after leaving Afghanistan. And at first, he taught me just the basic tenets of a religion that would go on to give me stability where there was none, rule following that gave me structure in my life, but also set a path toward radicalization. Told me one day that I had learned how to pray in Arabic, that I should go to the jailhouse, shower, wash every inch of my body, that when I came out, I would take my actual testimony of faith and become a Muslim. And that according to the religion, that meant everything that happened beforehand would be erased, that my identity would be erased, and that he'd give me a new identity and I'd be a clean slate, which I loved because I had grown to hate Jesse Morton. He gave me the name Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, Yunus being the prophet in the Quran and the Bible, which doesn't follow God's dictate to preach to his people. Instead, he tries to run. He's swallowed by the whale, spit back up on sea. And he's one of the most successful prophets in the monotheistic traditions, in the fact that he goes back to call his people to the religion as he was supposed to originally. And because he's experienced all of these negative consequences and traumas, he's very good at it, and he converts all of his people successfully. So this was used as a way to motivate me to call the people to Islam. It's prior to 9/11. And then one day we're praying in the back and we call the Adhan, the call to prayer for the Muslims. An African-American male gets upset by us waking him, stands in front of the prayer, in front of the Moroccan leading the prayer. The Moroccan tries to move him. He won't move. The Moroccan gets up and fights him. And I'm like shocked, because in America, we usually don't correlate spirituality and prayer with combat. It was my first sort of concept of this. And I asked him, why did you do that? And he says, well, there's a hadith, a narration attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that says, if someone comes and stands in front of your prayer, gently move them with your right hand to the side. But if they refuse to move, get up and fight them, for verily they are a devil. And then he tells me that, these are the circumstances that the weak will always have to fight against the oppressor, that the people who do not accept Islam are always hold animosity to it. They are kuffar. And he explains this concept to me. And he tells me about a situation that's going on in the world where in Afghanistan, the Taliban have controlled the state, and that they are implementing Sharia law, that the West will never be able to tolerate it. And he basically predicts the war on terror. Tells me that there's a hadith, a narration, that this suggests will be the beginning of the end of times, that the black flag of jihad will be raised in Khorasan, which the jihadists interpret to be Afghanistan, and it will not be stopped until it reaches Jerusalem. Now, I had absorbed a lot of far leftist commentary from people like Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky, anti-Israeli propaganda. So this really appealed to me, alongside of the fact that the archetype I wanted to become was Malcolm X. So I was really empowered by this narrative and really curious. I was released and changed my life completely. No drugs, no alcohol, no cigarettes, pray 5 times a day, fast 2 days a week, studied the religion prolifically. And then 9/11 happened. And in the aftermath of 9/11, George Bush said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And because of all of my resentment of the culture that is America, and I know now that it was really largely a projection of my own animosity and anger, because people didn't necessarily rescue me or see me as a person, I chose the terrorists. I started to study more and more about Al-Qaeda. By 2004, when we were invading Iraq, I was on the streets of 125th Street in Harlem, calling African Americans to not fight or support the war, because effectively they were Muslim, like the people that were being invaded, that it was a war against Islam, and that their identity had been taken from them on the slave ships that brought them here, because a large portion of African American slaves were originally from Muslim countries. That was very effective. I realized I had the gift of gab. I walked many, many, many people off to the mosque to take their own conversion. And then about a year after I started preaching and gaining more knowledge, I met an offshoot of the largest radicalization element in the United Kingdom called Al-Muhajirun. Their organization in New York City was called Islamic Thinkers Society. And I joined them immediately upon seeing them at the annual Muslim Day parade. And that gave me my first belonging to a network, because I was holding my own independent beliefs and radicalizing on my own. But now I wasn't engaged in an echo chamber, a human echo chamber, not the online echo chambers we see now. But they were very adamant about street proselytization and face-to-face encounters, whereas I was seeing social media and the development of the internet as a horizon that could reduce spatial and temporal restrictions. So I started to develop relations with people outside the Al-Muhajirun network, including Abdullah Faisal, a Jamaican cleric that I wrote and corresponded with, who was incarcerated in the UK for incendiary lecturing. He was deported ultimately and released in 2007 to Jamaica, and he had a very widespread following. And the way that he grew in popularity in the UK was he would record his lectures and he released them through Islamic bookstores on CDs. So I wanted to introduce him to the power of the internet. And I took myself and Abdullah Faisal, and I took another convert who was living in New York City, who became my best friend, whose name was Yusuf Al-Khattab. Yusuf Al-Khattab was an Orthodox Jew that lived in Gaza, that walked across the Gaza while the Israelis back then still ran Gaza. And he left and converted to Islam and moved to Jerusalem, where he became a very prominent radical who was interviewed by people like Richard Dawkins and had a prolific following on this new platform they called YouTube. And I thought that YouTube was the horizon of the future for radicalization. So long story short, I spent about 6 years running this organization with Abdullah Faisal and Yusuf Al-Khattab called Revolution Muslim. Ultimately, it was connected to 15 different terrorist plots. And what we did was we sort of innovated to make the Al-Qaeda message palatable for people that were in the West. So we created the very first English language jihadi magazines that became Inspired, that became Rumia. We developed a website called revolutionmuslim.com that was like the hub for our information that could not be taken down because it was hosted in Indonesia. We utilized Twitter, we utilized MySpace, we utilized Facebook. When I was ultimately indicted and arrested, I think they had a page and a half of different platforms that we had utilized to disseminate information. So we were very much the very first Western organization and very much the very first jihadist organization. We kind of exported our model to the Middle East as time went on, particularly under the era of ISIS. But we radicalized a lot of people. We're connected to a lot of terrorist plots, set forth a method and a model. People can read more about it in a paper that we published with my co-founder of my organization, now Mitch Silber, at New America Foundation. I forget what it's called, but it's very interesting to see how the ecosystem that we built and the model for radicalization recruitment we built was replicated. Long story short, the end came rushing in 2010 when I threatened the writers of South Park for portraying the Prophet Muhammad in a film, and it caused international controversy. Caused controversy to the degree that a woman out in Seattle started an Everybody Draw Muhammad Facebook page. That caused animosity amongst the Muslims because it's considered, sacrilegious to do so. Pakistan, Indonesia threatened to shut down Facebook. And by then, my colleagues Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan had moved and embedded themselves with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And they launched a replication of the English language jihadi magazines that I had designed with them from here in the United States out of Al-Qaeda, called Inspire magazine. And this was the very first form of propaganda. It was glossy. It was appealable to the Westerners. It's been correlated to so many cases of radicalization since then because it offered a new component. Because they were no longer in the United States, they could now give recipes for how to build weaponry or how to carry out terrorist attacks. And they included an article called How to Build a Bomb in Mom's Kitchen. The recipe in that has been utilized by innumerable terrorists, not just jihadists, but far right-wing extremists since then. And I knew my time was up, so I ran to Morocco. And it was in Morocco that I started a de-radicalization process. That certainly was a process, not an event. And I'll pause there because that was kind of a long tirade and let you guys follow up with whatever commentary or questions you may have.
Oh, I was just thinking about for like when you're talking about how you radicalize individuals before you start using like social networks and the internet to reach people, which is an incredibly effective way. If you were like meeting someone on the street and you were trying to kind of bring them over to your faith, but also like the more radical aspect of it, would you have a certain like play or you could spot an individual and know how susceptible they were to radicalization?
Well, I mean, truth be told, one of the major innovations and one of the most mistaken notions of radicalization processes is that there's a solely online operation that's not connected to the offline. So one of the reasons that counter messaging and countering violent extremism work don't work is because there's no activity in the real world. And so what we did was we would have these things called Dala stalls, where we would go to 42nd Street, which was great for visualization, downtown Manhattan. We would go to mosques and stand outside the mosque and preach radically, but we would film it all on video. And that was really the innovation that we brought to the table, because it looked like we were out there in the United States telling people that we unabashedly supported Al-Qaeda, loved Osama bin Laden more than we loved our own government. We would do things like rip flags, rip American flags, create controversy, get into the media. And so it's the offline documentation of what you're doing. That's what made ISIS's propaganda so powerful, because here you have, rather than 3 kids, 5 kids or 7 kids from New York City out there speaking and waving a black flag, you have actual battlefield operations that can, cut to an ideological narration. And so on our street proselytization, it was a lot of pamphleteering. We would use a generator, and we had a TV that would show George Bush saying this crusade is going to take a while, repetitively, and then it would show atrocities committed against Muslim civilians all over the world. That was an appeal to the general American Muslim population, particularly as the controversy and criticism of the Iraq War and Afghanistan War heat up. But then what we would do is we would stop passerby by aggressively having these posters and these signs that would be like, women in America are worth 25 cents. If you want to know that, go around the corner and check out a nude person on, a nude chick on 42nd and 8th Ave, right? So like that would provoke them to stop, and they'd be angered, and they wouldn't know that we were armed with all of the ammunition we needed to essentially humiliate them, because we knew what they were going to say and we knew a counter, and we would film it on video. So it looked like we were just having these one-on-one conversations and calling people to Islam. But in actuality, we were advocating for a radical ideology because we knew they weren't going to take it. What we were doing was we were showing people that we were intelligent, that we were proselytizing, that we were sacrificing. And that was the way we recruited and mobilized people to join our movement. It was really the connection between the offline and the online. And then with regard to the way that you identify people, your question about identifying people that are susceptible, it's really not like that. It's not brainwashing, because what you do as a recruiter is you're committed. You really believe you're a true believer. And so you believe you're doing God's work if you're a jihadist. And so we adhered very closely to Islamic scripture and interpretations. Now, what you do is you isolate text, right? So there's like a manipulation, but we took a statement from a very classical medieval scholar called Ibn Taymiyyah, who said that in a book called Amr bin Maruf wa Nahy al-Munkar, which means commanding the good and forbidding the evil. It's essentially a guideline for people that are going to go out into the society and cleanse society. And it says it's not the obligation of the person who is doing this to make everybody convert to the truth. It's your obligation to make the truth accessible to those that seek it. So the way that you see radicalization and recruitment is that there are people out there seeking for an identity, and they are individuals that are upon a path that if Allah guides them to you, this is destiny. And that's very powerful, invigorating, and empowering. And so it's a two-way street. It's top down because you feel gratified when you convert because you're doing God's work. Now, whether or not that's real, a lot of it probably has to do with narcissism, mental health, other variables, but that's the way you experience it, right? And a lot of it's just trauma thrown out into society, your anger and your resentment. When I look at myself preaching on the streets for the few videos that remain online, it's really hard for me to deal with, right? Because it's just an angry kid that needed a hug and needed somebody to, well, in some ways he needed a hug, and in other ways he needed spanked. It's something where there was just no ability to self-regulate my emotion. My anger was against myself, but I was throwing it outside of myself. So it's a top-down and a bottom-up process. And that is one of the fundamental distinctions that we need to realize in radicalization studies, because we oftentimes talk about recruitment as if it's brainwashing. We oftentimes talk about recruitment now as if it happens in a grooming way online. But in fact, the people that are online and radicalizing are already predisposed to look for a counterculture to belong to. And typically they'll grab onto the first one that they find. So, with lack of ability to go into the complexities behind that, that's the way that a radicalizer and a recruiter experiences it. They experience themselves as being upon a truth in a world where everyone else is ignorant. And that's a very arrogant space to find yourself in. But it's also invigorating and empowering.
That's absolutely fascinating to kind of hear that perspective, because, you hear so much in the media about radicalization and stuff. And I think people are very demonized, and we don't really understand their perspective. We're willing to just say, oh, that person's like crazy, right? Something was going to happen anyways. But I think it's really important to see like how effective these kind of strategies are in recruiting people. But since we're around like the halfway mark, I kind of want to ask, like, what was you touched on it slightly, but can you describe a bit more about your de-radicalization process? Were there any like real turning points that you can point to that kind of convinced you that you needed to seek a different path?
Yeah, there's definitely milestones that inform the work I do now. So when I ran away from the criminal charges after threatening the writers of South Park, I moved to Morocco. I moved to Morocco, and what I didn't realize cognitively would happen is I removed myself from a physical and online echo chamber. So because I was on the run from what could become criminal charges, I didn't communicate on a daily basis with the network. So I removed myself from the network indeliberately. And then context, as I said, is very important, because while I'm in Morocco, the Arab Spring broke out. And there's this massive wave of pro-democratization. There's this ethos that is sweeping up the entire world, inspiring protesters in Spain, and inspiring the Occupy movement, inspiring, Wisconsin labor rights advocates, and all over the world. It's like, finally, the Arab authoritarianism that ultimately Al-Qaeda wants to rid the Middle East of is being overthrown by a bunch of young people who are doing advocacy and are very much interested in rights that I took for granted my whole life. And during that period to survive, I was training or teaching Arab millennial youth to study for GRE, GMAT, ESL certifications so that they could move to the West to go to college. It was those conversations in the midst of the Arab Spring that really did help me identify with the fact that I was advocating for people that I never even knew and had no right to speak on their behalf for a future that they would have no control over. And that really kind of cast being able to personalize people that I would have called from the United States hypocrites, fake Muslims, probably apostates, and being able to humanize them through those conversations was very important. So getting in contact with people that are, as Jan Berger puts it in the Extremist book, which is a very good delineation, extremism is marked by in-group, out-group. So the out-group is evil, but the eligible in-group, the other Muslims that can join you, become even bigger enemies than the non-Muslim. And that's true in extremism in general. So in general, breaking down that eligible in-group bias and out-group bias was very key. I didn't change. I was just kind of noticing that things were going on inside of me. I had doubt. Then Osama bin Laden released a piece of propaganda, and because of that doubt, it fell flat. It was apparent that he was trying to rebrand Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's polling and support for Al-Qaeda was on the tank. And he released this absurd document on global warming. And it was just trash. And I was like, wow, this is just outside your perimeter. And if you're going to create policy in this so-called Islamic state you want to build, this is a joke. And it was interesting that I had that feeling, and I felt somewhat guilty for doing so. But nevertheless, they killed him. And 2 weeks later, they tried to arrest all of the proselytizers in the English language. They put indictments out that they had sealed, and mine was included in them. So I was arrested coming out of a Salafi mosque in Casablanca, spent 5 months in Moroccan jail. And then the next key milestone marker of my de-radicalization process happened when I was haphazardly incarcerated with Mohammed Fizazi, Salafi jihadi sheikh that was very popular, that now has de-radicalized. And he was waiting for release, having changed his opinions. And he would walk me around the yard every day and ask me, in Arabic, about my life, and was very careful and calculative as an Islamic scholar to not challenge my beliefs, but to get to know me as a person and to explain his own trajectory as an example and a model for me. And I found that was fascinating. It was my first contact with a former extremist. They had yet to even have former extremists in CVE at that point. It was 2011. So it was not something that was tried. And I spent some months with him, and then he was released. He started to write op-eds in the Moroccan press, and I was impressed by those op-eds. And by the time the Americans came to pick me up to take me back to the United States to charge me criminally, I was somewhat of a different person. When they picked me up in Casablanca, they dressed me like I was going to Guantanamo, orange jumpsuit, ears plugged, blinders on. shackles on my ankles. They sat me on the airplane. They pulled the shackles off. They pulled the earplugs out. They put the Quran down in front of me. And they said, you go by Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, but your legal name is Jesse Morton. What do you want us to call you? And interestingly enough, my knee-jerk reaction was Jesse Morton. So the identity that I tried to kill off from the time I was given my Islamic name suddenly burst back in. And that sat with me for the whole ride home. Basically told on myself, admitted to my guilt, was facing life in prison, thought it was too late, was flown back to the US, and I was housed in solitary confinement because if they put me in general population, they feared I'd be able to radicalize and recruit others. And I spent about a year in solitary confinement, which is supposed to entail 23-hour lockdown a day with 1 hour out of the cell. But a kind guard that thought that was cruel and unusual punishment, 4 days a week, 10-hour shifts, would take me to this law library, what housed the regular jailhouse library as well. And I started to spend those hours up there reading books like the Encyclopedia Britannica's Great Books of the Western World, diving into Enlightenment philosophy, looking at the history of the American Revolution, dissecting biographies of the founding fathers, because I was housed in Alexandria, Virginia. So the books that were donated to the jail were fascinating. Looked at, scientific books on complexity, on statistical analyses. They had textbooks and everything. And I kind of reawakened my ability to think for my own self, having spent nearly a decade of my life considering any knowledge that didn't come from the feet of a scholar as something that was a pathway to innovation, or bid'ah, as they call it in the Arabic language. So by the time I pled guilty and capped myself, I pled guilty to 3 charges that capped me at 15 years. But in order to get that agreement, I had to do a debriefing process with the FBI. And in the course of that, another fundamentally altering experience occurred where an FBI female agent, I'll just keep it simple, treat me like a human being and had empathy for me. Started to see that I was a little bit different than the person that they had arrested, and saw through that, even though I didn't reveal it. I was cooperative, and I learned about a terrorist plot back in the solitary confinement block. And I was faced with the conundrum of whether I apostate and tell on another Muslim, or whether I keep it silent and continue to adhere to my fundamentalism. And I told the FBI, and it ended up being a real plot, stopped the terrorist attack, developed some trust. And then ISIS starts breaking out, and the Syrian civil war becomes a jihad. And I have every ABC agency in government coming to meet with me to ask me what I think about the future. The Obama administration is trying to do countering violent extremism work. In 2011, they launched that in the United States. And I was asking to advise on how they could get that right. And I felt like I had the same meaning, purpose, and significance that the extremists offer me, which is another important milestone marker of de-radicalization. Long story short, I was sentenced to 11 and a half years in prison, but because we skillfully came up with ways to utilize me as an informant and find out about American ISIS supporters that had traveled abroad, and some of the chief propagandists that were utilizing my template now in a very prolific manner on social media, the English language magazines, the recruitment to an actual Islamic state, which is something we predicted. I was left go early on an 11 and a half year sentence and was released after 3.5 years on March 1st, 2015, thinking that I was completely de-radicalized. Worked for the US government as an analyst and eventually an informant for the first 2 years of my release, but was included in an indictment and was outed by the Washington Post as an informant, and didn't have much choice but to go public as America's first former jihadist. Thought I was de-radicalized, removed the ideology or the ideological adherence, but didn't change the culture or address the underlying traumas that caused my radicalization in the first place. And so after 14 years of complete abstinence from drugs and alcohol, I relapsed on cocaine. And then I realized that de-radicalization is a lot more than just removing yourself from belief in an ideology. You have to address the underlying symptoms and factors that made you susceptible to join that movement in the first place. And for me, it was trauma manifested as addiction. And I realized that the extremist ideology basically functioned as an opiate. So all of those sort of stages, it's a long process that I've now taken the next step in my de-radicalization efforts. That happened in 2017. And since then, I've been running my own nonprofit organization and learning more and more about my own process by taking care of my mental health, by taking care of my spirituality, by taking care of learning new lessons that have nothing to do with the ideology, but have everything to do with putting the ideological mindset or the mind back in the body, which is basically the core of trauma treatment and trauma-informed care.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating process, and I guess it really illuminates just how complex and individualistic the de-radicalization process is and the path towards rehabilitation. I have a bit of a broader, more general question though, just regarding the relationship between the prison system in the United States and radicalization. So I was wondering, just from your own experiences and opinions, would you say that the prison system tends to reinforce radical tendencies, or can it also provide critical opportunities to de-radicalize individuals?
Well, it depends. If an individual inmate finds ways to meet their unfulfilled needs and then develops from that new belonging in a new network and a new ideology, and then from there alters their story, then they could de-radicalize or prevent radicalization in prison settings. Most of the research on radicalization in American prisons towards Islamism or jihadism shows that there's very few cases of such in the prison system. However, that's one of the key things we have to learn now, because in my opinion, on the far right, radicalization in American prisons is a complete incubator likely to facilitate over the next ensuing years many people, because it's very different, because the ethos and the ideology that is predominant in the American prison system for Muslims is the Saudi Arabian anti-extremist literalism of Salafism. And that tends to be, contrary to popular belief, a very good buffer against becoming a Salafi jihadist. Very many of the teachings that are involved that are led by inmates, it's interesting because it's a decentralized system, because if the inmates are Salafist and they send to Sufi, the inmates don't go to Juma. They run their own show. But as part of running their own show in every institution I was in, there's a lot of classes on why. I mean, I was there when ISIS was breaking out. So there was a lot of classes from self-taught imams that were inmates on, terrorism and why it was against Islam. And I found that to be a very good buffer. It didn't matter to me because I was already educated in the religion. So my process of de-radicalization occurred by reading books on my own and reverse engineering sort of the processes of indoctrination. But I did learn a lot about it. And now my organization does deal on a Department of Homeland Security grant with convicted extremism-related offenders and preparing them for reintegration. And it has been absolutely fascinating over the years. We have worked with over 250 incarcerated terrorism-related convicts, developed a workbook that allows us to establish rapport based on narrative therapy and trauma-informed care. And then they come home and they receive an array of social services from us and case management services that has proven a good bridge between prison and their reentry. And that's not just jihadists, that's also far left and far right wing convicted extremists.
Yeah, it was interesting because when you think of someone who becomes radicalized towards like an extreme version of Islam, typically that happens in like the UK or in European settings, because in Canada, they did a study and they found that individuals weren't really prone to become radicalized like towards extreme Islam, just because the gangs that are in prison really won't allow it. They'll take those individuals and they won't allow the others to sort of run free. But in terms of your work right now with your not-for-profit, do you find it easy to connect with people who might be, let's say, like if you're dealing with a right-wing extremist, do you find it easier to connect with them just based on you have a similar, not necessarily a similar, but you have gone through the experience of radicalization? Or is there kind of a bridge because you went down a separate path towards a completely different group?
Well, I've become somewhat of an expert in far right-wing extremist ideologies and view them very differently because we take an empathy-based approach. I have found that we work with former far right-wing extremists in our organization, and a right-wing extremist is much more likely to talk to a jihadist than they are former right-wing extremists, because in the same way a jihadist would consider someone who left their interpretation of Islam as an apostate, a lot of people in the far right can feel the same way. And so it's having that understanding of the ideological nuance and the bona fide sort of backstory of having once been a radical, and the empathetic approach where I can communicate with them, at least initially, in their epistemological and philosophical outlook, rather than asking them to come around to a more liberal mindset at first, that I can promote disengagement. And then the de-radicalization process from there is a little bit more tricky. But yeah, I mean, I think we're very much conflating far right-wing extremism with jihadism. I think one of the things that's definitely true and that we need to discover quickly is that the two are fundamentally different. And then on top of that, I think that as a consequence of conflating those two, we're replicating a lot of mistakes we made in CVE with regard to how we intended to do good with the jihadist milieu, but we're in some ways replicating the same mistakes that made CVE get stigmatized from amongst Western Muslim communities and rejected and seen as an overreach, a tool for surveillance, a manipulation to spy, and to entrap with interdiction and investigation. And I really fear that if we have the same consequence with the far right, you know, extremist Muslims in our societies represent typically much lower than 1% of our population. When we talk about those that are susceptible to right-wing radicalization, if we replicate those same mistakes, we're dealing with 30% at least of our populations that are susceptible to right-wing extremism, particularly amongst our Caucasian or white populaces. And so, yeah, I mean, that's part of the fundamentally fascinating component of the work that we do now, because we don't just work with jihadists. It has allowed me to dabble with this fascinating question of whether or not extremisms are extremism, right? And they're all kind of the same, or whether or not each different ideological milieu needs to be treated with a very different remedy. The results are mixed. In some ways, they're the same, and in some ways, they're very different. And I think that that's where the next wave of radicalization research could benefit the most, particularly research that is aligned to inform preventing and countering violent extremism practice.
That's interesting because, you know, we hear so much, at least like, especially us when we go through Twitter, we see so much about basically like the horseshoe theory, right? A lot of people are saying that they're so similar, like far right and jihadists. But, you know, what you're saying is that we need to take a more in-depth look and not just paint it as, oh, they're both radicals, they must be similar. So I find that interesting. You say that, kind of tying together what we've been talking about a bit. We've touched on ISIS or ISIL quite a bit. It's been kind of recurring, but, you know, back in say 2018 or whatever, a lot of people kind of predicted after the loss of territory in Syria and Iraq that ISIL would become basically a virtual caliphate. And, you know, it did for a while. That's where it was largely occurring. But then recently we've seen with the fallout from Afghanistan and ISIL-K, so the Khorasan province, claimed the attack on the airport in Kabul. So considering this, and that we're seeing like a real resurgence of violent jihadism in that area, considering this, what do you think needs to be done to prevent another wave of foreign fighters from joining ISIL or other jihadist causes right now, especially considering all the problems with CVE?
Well, I mean, this is emblematic of the problem of replicating the same mistakes. So one of the things that we did wrong in understanding jihadist terrorism, and this is congruent with just what you could expect naturally, but it should not be congruent with expertise. We imparted cognitive biases that conflated Islamism and jihadism in the same way that we are talking about those from the radical right wing, as if they are one step away from becoming terrorist, and as if radicalization is in and of itself a gateway into violent extremism. Very low base rate of radicals become violent extremists. And when you conflate cognitive radicalization with violent extremist behavior, and you try to address cognitive radicalization in the same manner that you would address violent extremism, you unintentionally make the problem worse, because the remedy for both is completely different. In fact, in some ways, some of your cognitively radicalized individuals, like the Muslim Brotherhood or the Saudi Arabian Salafists, are your best incubators and allies in identifying those individuals that could be susceptible to violent extremism. And we distance ourselves from good relations at a governmental level with the American Muslim community because we weren't able to differentiate between the two, the radicals and the extremists. I think we're doing the same thing with the far right. I also think that the concern for white supremacist far right-wing extremism is largely a consequence of the war on terror and our inability to recognize the contextual circumstances that also facilitate radicalization is a big problem, because as I said when we started, you can shape the context and the environment of that surrounds an individual a lot more than you can affect an individual, right? And so the circumstances that we set up over the last 20 years, waging wars abroad against an existential threat and allocating a lot of resources, might have been better to respond to 9/11 with a "we believe in democracy and human rights, we've been attacked, but what we're going to do to respond is build an even better advocacy for democracy and human rights by making our own societies more democratic and building what was called by John Winthrop at the onset of the American system, or the American system's development, building a city on the hill that could shine so that other countries could adopt democratic principles." I feel like we betrayed democracy, and I feel like we betrayed our own people. And a recent study from the Parler API data that was leaked showed that a overwhelming proportion of those that attended the Capitol riots came from districts or counties in the United States where there was a correlation between the number of deaths associated with the war on terror, of people that traveled in the war on terror to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq and were killed. And that's a key finding that for certain, I would say is a big problem. And then my organization was one of the most prominent in having the courage to say that this overwhelming concentration on far right-wing extremism is paying attention to fluctuations that can always be temporary, and that you have to concentrate on extremism and you have to concentrate on the reciprocal relationships between extremist movements. And so now we're mesmerized by the fact that the domestic far right is now applauding the Taliban's overthrow of the American imposed Afghan government. And now we will race again in the same way that countering violent extremism has always been reactionary, to think about what we might do to confront jihadism. So I think that's a problem, because the number one way to influence that would have been in so many ways to practice what we preach. And I like to say that it's not always about who the extremists are, but it's about who we are. And now we're going to be tried and tested in that, because not only are people going to create a wave of migration that could be to join the Taliban, which might be a legitimately recognized government. And if that is the case, then you will not be able to stop people from joining the Taliban. But increasingly, we have seen the indictments over the last few years in the United States be aligned with people that are trying to travel to all different kinds of places, whether that be Yemen, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. There's been a lot of indictments that are related to different spaces of migration. And now everybody loves a strong horse. So when it's perceived to be that bin Laden's war of attrition against the Americans was proven to be true, it's almost as if victory is on the horizon, in the same way when ISIS announced its caliphate. So, but in order to deal with that, we need to alter the way that we see countering violent extremism. Countering violent extremism is still affiliated with scientific reductionism, serious monocausality, and problems with regard to the correlations between one variable and the other variable of being radicalization into violent extremism. So much more complex, so much easier to address the macro than it is to address the micro. And the way that we address it sometimes comes from a very privileged perch that's marred by those cognitive biases that I'm talking about, and can actually be counterproductive, because a lot of the narrative on the far right, for example, is very, very, very much driven by political currents that are probably temporary. There was a lot of support under the Trump administration, and reasonably so, for more far leftist approaches to like anti-fascism. In reality, the anti-fascists have grown under the cloak of being able to portray themselves as combating white supremacies to become a violent extremist element in and of their own right that is not conducive to thwarting fascism, but is actually conducive to facilitating radicalization into fascist perspectives. We now deal with a situation where we were really glad that Donald Trump got out of power, but now we have a Biden administration that has to govern. and is not governing effectively and is looking at a midterm defeat here in the United States. If things continue, the approval ratings have dropped from 53% to 42% over recent weeks. And it looks like the Republicans will take back over the Senate and the House of Representatives. But we also set forth a wave for what resembles an interwar between World War I and World War II, where there was a general silencing of fascist tendencies and nationalist tendencies in the aftermath of World War I. But because the governing Democratic parties did not fulfill the economic needs of their people, it only birthed the fascism we saw with World War II. So now we face an even more radicalized right wing, which now the radical notions of the right wing have been they've become the conservative party because of people like Tucker Carlson platforming different views and reaching all of the conservative audience. And that is becoming the mainstream view. We face the very real prospects that we will see a replication of that surging fascism coming in the next presidential election process, probably with Donald Trump has already said he's going to run again. So I think that we are oftentimes unable to see these complexities. We talked about it early on. We take a lot of controversy from the experts in the field because of the things we say. We talk to fascists. We have no problem talking to fascists. We don't believe in censorship. We don't believe in deplatforming. We don't believe in any of the things that have become standard operating procedures because I live them. And I know that the best thing that ever happened to us was when they started to kick us off of YouTube, because we could complain that the conspiracy theories we were espousing were true. We always adapted. We figured out ways around it. And in the long run, we never grew in numbers. Temporarily, we would gain a reduction, but within a year, we would be right back where we were. And in fact, even more prolific. I really fear that that's the case. And I fear that the only solution is actually to now look at the world and say, 20 years into the global war on terror, where do we stand? When the Biden administration first came into power, they said that they wanted to reduce an emphasis and a concentration on counterterrorism, and to now engage in what was facilitated by the war on terror, big power state competition. Russia, China, Iran, and its authoritarian allies are now calling for a dismantlement of the liberal world order that we established after World War II. And they're calling for an international rule-based order, which is basically a guise for authoritarianism and top-down command. We don't have the reputation nor the soft power any longer to fight that war. And because we've just been kicked out of Afghanistan, we've lost a presence that can prevent the evolution of Central Asia to being under Russian and Chinese control. So look for China to sign an agreement with the Taliban that will accept them building their Belt Road Initiative. Their Belt Road Initiative would run high-speed train all the way through the old Silk Road, all the way into Europe. It would be a way for them to get rid of the dollar bill holdings that they have and to translate into wider adoption of the renminbi currency. And it could very much dismantle what we enjoy as called in economic terms, exorbitant privilege. The fact that we can print the dollar bill at will because every central bank in the world has to hold on to dollar bill assets because it is the monetary currency that drives the international monetary order. We are really looking, if we don't wake up, at waking up one day and realizing that we're in a 2007, 2008 scenario where there is a collapse pending on Wall Street, where everybody is looking at economic catastrophe, and all that will do is birth what is happening in Portland and other cities like it with regard to absolute chaos on the streets, the dismantlement of local government. People already don't trust the institutions. And the only way we can effectively pause that is if we get CVE right, because countering violent extremism is the ultimate symptom of a root disease. So if we can pause radicalization trajectories, if we can pause the amount of violent extremist mass killings, then we can take a pause and we can say, okay, how can we correlate what we're learning here to our ability to repair the damaged reputation we have on the international stage and to utilize more allocation of funding for peace building, for conflict prevention programming, for preventing and countering violent extremism initiatives abroad so that people can believe in democracy again. And so had we allocated $5 trillion to the promotion of democracy and development, we could have rebuilt the entire Middle East and gave every single influential advocate for democracy across the world large sums of money to disseminate our ideas. And that really, to me, is the solution. Is it needs to be a decentralized, people-led approach. We have to get the youth to understand the dangers of authoritarianism, that they are inefficient, and we have to, sometimes you got to say sorry for the mistakes that you made. I think the West has to apologize for the war on terror, and say that we've learned from it. And I don't think that we can get around the hubris that drives us to do so. But I really think that we need to start to think of CVE as something that addresses the micro and the meso factors of radicalization. But if it's not linked to a differentiated ability to address the hyperpolarization that is affecting the macro, then we're screwed. Long story short.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that too, because unless you have like a societal change in terms of the reduction of polarization, then what can you do? Because I think what you do with CV is incredibly important by working with the individual and helping people. But like, it feels like today we're so taken apart from others, like with COVID-19 misinformation. I mean, you look at the Stop the Steal, just a variety of issues that we see in Canada too, and are definitely driving sort of right-wing involvement.
Yes.
So it's such a tough hill to climb.
That's largely affiliated with the lack of institutional trust. And people don't talk about the core driver of that, right? So like democracies, like back when we were living in tribal societies before the nation state, before the development of democratic institutions and state building, we trusted in our tribe and we all knew each other. And so there was a cohesiveness there that formulated a solidified identity and allegiance to a tribal leader. When you get democracy and you get voting and you get other decentralization of individual liberty and freedom, then you have to have a trust in the governing institutions in order for it to be preserved, or else the tribe breaks down. And now we're living in very tribal-like situations because nobody refers to the institutions that underlie our society and that the people of our society depend on, and we're all polarized. And each group is calling the other group, the insane ones, but at the end of the day, we are growing more and more radical as a result of that hyperpolarization and entering into a phase of reciprocal dehumanization where in reality, both sides are completely wrong. And there's a natural tendency and a cognitive bias to choose a side when the situation goes into an us versus them divide on a macro level. And that's what happens when you precede civil war and civil strife. The way to deal with these conspiracy theories is to rebuild trust. And you can't rebuild trust if you're not engaging and communicating. So by isolating these people, by trying to silence them, by trying to kick them off of social media, they will not only adapt, but you will create a complete hyperpolarization of the social media landscape, which in turn creates echo chambers that further facilitate reciprocal dehumanization. And while it's really hard to bear the hate speech that comes out of extremist organizations, you almost have to. But you have to combat it. You have to invest and convince people in your society that we know, psychologically speaking, social psychologically speaking, sociologically speaking, neuroscientifically speaking, that shutting people down doesn't work. And we know that challenging their beliefs rationally, which is what we do with counter messaging and mistake all the time. People radicalize because of emotion. You have to appeal to their emotions first. What we need to do is we need to create fora where we can just pause the exacerbating hyperpolarization, realize that it's going to take us a decade or more to gain back trust in institutions, but then also to check our own inequalities. The people that are representing the institutions come from classes that are radically different economically now. So if we can reduce that class disparity, if we can reduce the gap in inequality and wealth that is exacerbated since the 1990s, that in and of itself is not directly correlated to hyperpolarization, but in fact it is. And that's why it's important to think with complexity, right? Because this is something that we can't do. And like, you'll find very few experts in countering violent extremism that can speak about economic theory as easily as they can speak about the radicalization literature, as easy as they can speak about history. So CVE has to become a multidisciplinary field of study. And it's been predominated by sociologists, by psychologists, and by data scientists that have specialization, that concentrate on individual case studies and then build out a lot of those biased understandings that do things like exploit a low base rate bias to suggest that all radicals are one step away from becoming violent extremists, thereby stigmatizing people that have legitimate grievances that are definitely interpreted wrong with regard to their solutions, but to recognize that some of their grievances legitimate is the first step to developing a conversation. And as my colleague Daryl Davis says, when people are talking, they're not fighting. And that's the first step in reversing these processes.
Hayden, do you want to speak or can I go? Okay, sweet. So that was super fascinating to hear about that kind of polarization. I mean, we've seen it. You're obviously coming from an American perspective, and we're here in Canada right now, and we're even seeing it on a huge scale, especially with what's happening. I mean, even in our city of Winnipeg, where we're right now, it's not big on the map, but we just recently, like within this past week, had people go to the hospital and try to like block people from going in because they were basically protesting against lockdown measures and that kind of thing. So we're seeing hyperpolarization in every aspect of our society. And I think it's something that absolutely needs addressing without necessarily demonizing the other side, because obviously people have their reasons for their grievances. So with all this being said, like, this has been such a great conversation, and I kind of just want to have just one final question to you. And that's, if you could speak to somebody who is going along the radicalization process as we speak right now, what would you say to them?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that it's a process, not an event. So it's not about what you first say to them. It's about whether or not you can establish trust and rapport with them. So we utilize a methodology that allows us to measure the impact of different stages of the intervention. It has a sort of a catchy name that's attached to our complex ecosystemic approach. It's also the title of one of our counter right-wing counter messaging tools called Control, Alt, Delete, Hate. And the control phase is all about pausing between the space of stimulus and response. The alt phase is about altering the course and reorienting radical energies in a positive pro-social direction. And then the delete hate phase is to impart an awareness that we are hyperpolarizing, that we are threatened, that for all of its imperfections, democratic societies certainly supersede and are superior to authoritarian ones and extremism ones. And that's the end part of a process. So at the first stages, you don't really want to say anything to anyone. You want to listen. But in order to get them to talk to you, you have to explain certain things, right? And you have to strategically and skillfully address what it is that you wanted to speak to them about. And what that requires is an ability to look at a person and to not demonize them. To do it implicitly or explicitly is important, because if you're educated in counseling and interventions, then you understand a phenomenon called transference and countertransference, where you can trigger them seeing you as the enemy. And that's why interventions with involuntary celibates don't work, because a lot of the social workers are not educated in their ideology. That's why a lot of like there's very little success cases, despite organizations that portray that they do interventions. Almost nobody calls them, because they're perceived to be, just advocates of the other side at this point. Right. So you have to really listen, and you have to talk in terms that they know. And you have to, even if it's uncomfortable for you, show some understanding. Right. And so there's a reason for an entry point to a person where a person's willing to talk to you. It could be writing them a letter in prison. It could be identifying them online. It could be them contacting you. And the first thing that you have to do is you have to find out as much you can about the individual before you speak with them, and then come up with a strategy. And the answer to your question is, every initial conversation is completely different, because every individual on the planet is an individual. But it's that expertise in ideology, the expertise in radicalization studies, and the multidisciplinary approach that understands trauma-informed care, counseling. I used to be a mental health substance abuse counselor. I find myself using a lot of the tools of substance abuse counseling and treating extremism as an addiction. But it's totally unique to each individual. It also depends on the role that they have in the organization. Like if we're pulling out a charismatic preacher, it's very different than pulling out a low-level kid that's just entered the movement. If we're talking to a woman or a man whose loved one is radicalizing to a conspiracy theory or a COVID anti-vax conspiracy, then we need them to impart a better awareness of who they're talking to. And getting somebody else to talk is a lot different than you talking. So each case is totally unique. And that's why it's really important to respect the fact that one of the key findings in research in terrorism and radicalization is that there is no terrorist profile. There are pathways, There are indicators that can be similar, but the primary conclusion of over 2 decades, actually over 4 decades of research to look for a terrorist profile, is that every case of radicalization is a highly individualized process. So each conversation would look differently, each objective, each approach would look differently. But the real answer is to try to come up with a strategy where you can see, if I develop a relationship with this individual, I have a network that can offer the same meaning, purpose, significance, belonging, camaraderie, empowerment that extremists offer. And that's the one thing intervention programs don't typically do, because we think in individualistic terms. If you don't offer an answer to an individual that says, okay, you're right, I want to leave. Now, where do I go? And you don't have an answer for that, totally pointless.
Absolutely. So we're kind of going to wrap up now, but we want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. You know, you have a lot of stuff to do. So to agree to talk to us was really meaningful. And I think I can speak for my colleagues when I say we actually learned quite a bit from this discussion today. And hopefully to our audience, you learned something as well. And we hope we can speak again sometime soon, Jesse.
Very good.